In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Blasphemous Herald build, which is an evolution of both the Blasphemous Beastmaster build and the Hellfire Herald build, sort of combined into one build to make one extremely powerful setup. So the general concept is that you're going to be using the Blasphemous Blade like we were in the Blasphemous Beastmaster build, and you're combining that with the jump attacks into greatswords of the Hellfire Herald in order to give you flexibility. You can use the, Taker's Flame ability of Blasphemous Blade in order to do substantial damage at range, or you can get up close and use jump attacks with dual greatswords. And what I really like about this build is it still maintains the ability to do physical and fire damage, or physical and holy damage, depending on what you're facing, so you can swap your Ashes of War and weapons around and still, have the appropriate weapon type and damage for the, enemy that you're facing. So obviously the primary weapon we're using here is the Blasphemous Blade. This deals physical and fire damage, and it has Taker's Flame ability, which does incredible damage at range and heals you. What's really great about this build too is you're really durable. You have tons of armor, tons of protection, and you can just shrug off damage. You can heal it over time using incantations, and you can gain it back with Taker's Flame. So you just absolutely, never run out of health really with this build, and you deal so much damage. I think I first tried every boss while I was playing with this build. It's arguably one of the strongest, if not the strongest build I've played. You really don't have to be a Souls connoisseur in order to use this build well. And it's just really fun. I really love playing with this playstyle, and I feel like adding the Blasphemous Blade to it just makes it even more, incredible. And if you saw Tyr doing the gameplay with his playthrough, he used a very similar build to this, and he was just absolutely slaughtering everything. So another weapon we use for this build, besides the Blasphemous Blade, is Gargoyle's Black Blade. This is another great sword that has a weapon ability that's very, very similar. Corpse Wax Cutter does a very similar animation, has a little bit shorter range, a little bit lower damage. It does put the Black Flame type status effect on enemies it hits, sapping some of their health, which is great. But it does holy damage, and it deals substantial holy damage. It's probably the highest damage holy scaling greatsword in the game if you had to pound for pound put their, attack ratings against each other. And what this does is you can swap this out with your Blasphemous Blade when you want to do holy damage, and then take the greatsword that we're going to use in the offhand and change the Ash of War on it back and forth between fire or sacred, flame art and sacred, in order to deal, fire or holy damage, still giving you that all fire physical damage setup or all holy physical damage setup that we were using in the Hellfire Herald build. And what I really love about the, Gargoyle's Black Blade as well is that the weapon skill is so similar to the Blasphemous Blade that, you can literally swap them out at will and you would play almost exactly the same way. You don't have to learn a different weapon art. It's basically exactly the same with a little bit shorter range. And that brings us to the greatsword that we're going to use in the offhand, which is the Gargoyle's Greatsword. You can also use the Iron Greatsword as well. Either one of these works fine here, and probably the Iron Greatsword with the patch 1.04 probably comes out a little bit ahead in terms of damage. It weighs a little bit more, and it has a little bit worse faith scaling. The Gargoyle's Greatsword is the only greatsword that can have its Ash of War replaced that has B scaling in faith, which is a reason that I chose it here. But you can interchange it with the Iron Greatsword. So if you already have an upgraded Iron Greatsword, I would just stick with that. But if you want to go for style and you want to get a little bit better faith scaling, or if you plan to take this build up higher levels and you're going to increase faith more, you'll probably get more damage out of the Gargoyle's Greatsword in the long run. There are two Ash of Wars that I like to use for the Gargoyle's Greatsword, and the first one is Flaming Strike. This allows you to cast out a little bit of flame and then swing your weapon through it, coating it on fire. This gives you a little bit extra fire damage. It buffs your weapon for a little bit of time, so you can buff up with it, go back to dual wielding, and then resume your attack playstyle, and you'll get a little bit more damage out of the left weapon, which is great. And the other one I like to use when you're going for the holy setup is Sacred Order. This does a similar thing. It allows you to buff your weapon with more holy damage. It doesn't have as long a wind-up as Sacred Blade does, which is why I like it. It doesn't, shoot out projectile like Sacred Blade, but it allows you to buff very easily. So you can increase the holy damage or increase the fire damage depending on which one of these you're using. And it, stay there when you go back to dual wielding, so when you're jump attacking, you'll get that extra damage. And beyond that, I like to use the Clawmark Seal in order to give me a seal that scales off strength and faith. You're going to have kind of split attributes between strength and faith here. They're not exactly split, but this will allow you to get more incantation scaling from those strength points. Otherwise, you're going to have lower incantation scaling. You don't use a lot of incantations that deal, offensive damage with this build because your incantation scaling is just not good enough to use them primarily. But they are there if you need some range in, a pinch. Maybe you have a scenario where you just need to finish an enemy off with one lightning spear or a black flame or something, and it'll make your life a lot easier. It's there for that. Or take out a couple birds at range so they don't ambush you. It's there to give you a little bit of utility, but it's not to be, it's not going to be the main focus of the build. One of the reasons that we have split attributes, meaning that we are increasing our strength and faith relatively similarly with this build compared to something like the Crusader build where we went minimum strength investment, all faith, is that both the Blasphemous Blade and the Gargoyle's Black Blade drop off significantly in damage after 50 strength and after 50 faith. So you're not gaining a lot of damage with those weapons. So if you cranked faith all the way up, you would miss out on a lot of, physical damage that you would do with these weapons. And you do a lot of jump attacks, so you want that melee damage there. Compared to the Gargoyle's Greatsword, that doesn't drop off nearly as much. Your Gargoyle's Greatsword isn't optimized for this build the way those two weapons are, but those are your primary weapons, and they're the ones you're using the weapon skills with and that you're going to be using primarily, which is why we optimize them with this build. When it comes to armor for this build, we're using the Raptor's Black Feathers for the chest piece to get the increase to jump attack damage, just like the Hellfire Herald build. We need maximum jump attack damage. It's something we do frequently with this build, so we want that. And then the other 3 slots are just maximum armor. Like whatever you can get away with in Steel Medium Roll, you're going to slot here. Again, you want maximum protection between the armor, Golden Vow, and between the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman. You're going to have substantial physical damage reduction. And if you use Black Flame's protection with this, you'll just have tons and tons of damage reduction when it comes to physical damage, allowing you to just shrug off hits. And because you regain health with Taker's Flame, and you can set, use one of the incantations that gives you a heal over time, you should be at or around full health most of the time with this build. When it comes to talismans for this build, I have the Great Jar's Arsenal, the Claw Talisman, Shard of Alexander, and the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman. Great Jar's Arsenal is there to allow you to increase your equip load high enough to use very heavy armor and still medium roll. This is one of the best ways to do this. This saves us a ton of points in endurance. We still have a significant amount of points invested in endurance at 30. But if you don't have this, you're going to have to invest maybe another 10 to 12 points here. And you want those to go into a damaging ability if possible. You could actually use Radagon's Source Seal in place of this in order to give you a substantial boost in stats, because you do need strength with this build. You do need endurance. You do need HP. And dexterity boosts the damage of Blasphemous Blade significantly as well. Does about as good as scaling as strength and faith. So that helps that. However, it does increase the damage you take markedly. And since we're going for maximum protection, we're trying to avoid using it here. The Claw Talisman is there to increase your damage with jump attacks. Self-explanatory, you do lots of jump attacks. You want maximum damage when you're doing that. Shard of Alexander is there to increase your damage with Taker's Flame and Corpse Wax Cutter. You're going to use these quite regularly, so being able to get maximum damage when you use them is great. These absolutely hit like a truck, although Taker's Flame is a bit better, but you want as much damage as you can when you're hitting with them. And lastly, we have the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman to increase our physical protection by about 20% or so, depends on what your numbers are. But between Golden Vow and that, and if you're using Black Flame's protection, you're going to have absolutely absurd physical damage protection, and most enemies in the game do physical damage. So you're going to be able to just shrug off attacks, jump attack through it, which is really good. You could make a case to use the Ritual Sword Talisman here if you want. That will boost both your spell damage and your regular attack damage and your weapon skill damage, and that's something you use all 3 of these in this build. You do have to be at max HP when using it, but you are quite frequently this build. You could swap out something like Alexander's Jar Shard for that, or you could swap out Claw Talisman in order to get that damage spread around more. But again, I don't feel like I use spells a ton in this game, but still there is, a scenario where maybe you're going to be fighting a boss and it's just easier to attack at range for part of a fight, and maybe you want to swap out one of those to get more spell damage for that fight and then swap back. When it comes to spells for this build, I'm using Golden Vow in order to increase our damage and damage resistance. Self-explanatory. We have Blessing of the Erd Tree for a better heal over time. This is going to heal you 12 FP every tick. This is a really good way to keep your health up, and as I mentioned, you have high physical protection, so you're not going to take a lot of damage when you get hit, and this can just keep you topped up over and over as you're running around jump attacking. Black Flame's protection is another really good option for this build. It and Golden Vow can be buffed together at the same time, though you can't use Flame Grant Me Strength and Black Flame's protection at the same time, so if you want to prioritize offense, you're going to use Flame Grant Me Strength. If you want to prioritize defense, you're going to use Black Flame's protection. And obviously, if Flame Grants Me Strength gives you plus 20% physical damage and fire damage, Blasphemous Blade does both those types, and if you're using the Gargoyle's Greatsword with Flaming Strike, it's also going to do both those, so it's really good. It has a short duration, so you're probably only going to use this for tough, enemies or boss fights. Besides those, I have Lightning Spear, Stone of Garank, and Black Flame just for some ranged options. That's lightning, fire, and physical damage. Again, ranged options are very, very secondary or even tertiary with this build. you're not really trying to use them. I have it set up to give you the most damage you can and still maintain the playstyle of that Hellfire Herald and combined with the Blasphemous Beastmaster. But they're there if you need them for certain circumstances where range will just get the job done better. When it comes to stats, I have 50 Vigor, 26 Mind, 30 Endurance, 40 Strength, 15 Dexterity, 9 Intelligence, 50 Faith, and 9 Arcane. 50 Vigor is there to give you tons of health. Again, you're just going to play really, really aggressively with this build. You're going to take damage. You're going to shrug off a lot of it, and you want to be able to just survive while you kill the enemy and play really, really aggressively. One of the things that's really fun about this build is how aggressively you can play, and having high health allows that to happen. 26 Mind is there to give you enough FP to use Taker's Flame and to use Corpse Wax Cutter and all the buffs you need to use, and still get away with about 3 or 4, maybe even 5 FP flasks while you have the majority of them into HP. 30 Endurance is there in order to use very, very heavy armor and still be able to medium roll when combined with Great Jar's Arsenal. You can actually take this up higher if you want to get even more protection. I'm not using the heaviest armor that you could use. So if you're going to take this build higher or you want even more protection, you'll adjust this up. 40 Strength is there to increase the damage with all of our great swords. All the great swords scale off that. And as I mentioned, after about 50, they start to drop off. So, we didn't want to go too much higher than that. And if you're going higher with this build, you definitely want to take that up to 50 to get even more damage. 15 Dexterity is there to meet the requirements for Blasphemous Blade. The reason we haven't really cranked this, even though it does increase the damage of Blasphemous Blade a lot, and the other great swords a little bit, is because the seal that we're using, Clawmark, scales off Faith and Strength. So putting points into Dexterity, although it increases your weapon damage, doesn't increase your incantation scaling, so it's last in the list in terms of stats to increase our weapon damage. However, if you plan to advance this build even further, like up to 200 or something, you'll get Strength up to 50, and then you'll probably take Dexterity up to 50 as well. Intelligence is at 9 because we don't need it for this build, and Faith is at 50, as I already mentioned, because that's the point where damage really starts to drop off. It also makes it so you can use any of the incantations in the game that don't use Arcane or Intelligence, really. So, if you want to use Elden Stars or something, you could throw it into this build. Won't hit for the most damage it could do, but that spell doesn't do a ton of damage anyway. And we don't need any Arcane for this build because we're not using any Arcane-based incantations or incantations that have Arcane requirements. Just a couple final tips before you wrap up this video. I don't recommend using a Holy Greatsword, like if you go the Holy version of the Gargoyle's Greatsword in one hand and the Blasphemous in the other, mixing that together and having Fire and Holy, because if you want to use Flame Grant Me Strength, it's going to benefit 2 Fire Swords better than 1 Fire Sword and a Holy Sword. Or if you use something like the Flame Scorpion Charm or Fire Scorpion Charm, it's going to boost both Fire Swords, or if you use the Sacred one, it's going to boost both Holy Swords. So it's better to keep the damage types the same, in my opinion, and just find the one that the enemy is weakest to and use both of those against them, rather than trying to, do some hybrid where you're doing both damage types and you're doing okay damage all the time. And if you're using the Flask of Wondrous Physique, you're going to want to either put Holy or Fire damage in there depending on which setup you're using. Again, you're going to swap this back and forth. And the other one, I like to do the one with Stamina Regen. I love the Green Turtle Talisman. There isn't a huge spot for it in this build without losing out on damage. You could use it if you want. But because we don't have that extra regeneration from the Green Turtle Talisman, I like to get that percentage from the tier that does that, so that you have your stamina comes back a lot quicker during boss fights, allowing you to do more jump attacks more frequently. Stay tuned for more Elden Ring builds. We still have the Black Flame Bushido build, which is a Dexterity Faith Samurai build, and I have lots more builds planned on the way. I'm really hoping that patch 1.04 will allow me to use a lot more weapon skills effectively and use a lot more spells, so I'm hoping to showcase some of them in future builds.